Hi, impromptu listeners. This is Hadley Robinson, one of the audio producers with Washington Post Opinions. So, we're still working away at new programming to come later this fall. But in the meantime, we wanted to share some of the stories that have been resonating with our readers lately. In this first one, we've got Washington Post contributing columnist and a familiar voice on impromptu, Theodore Ted Johnson. Hi, Ted. Thanks for being here today.
Great to be back.
So, you've got a story for us today about several events converging. It's the 20-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina this week, which was also a time in our history when the National Guard was deployed to an American city, which is feeling kind of familiar right now. I know you have some thoughts and personal experience around these events, so I just was wondering, what made you want to write this story, and why do you think it matters right now?
Yeah, I was at an event recently, sort of marking this 20th anniversary of Katrina. And one of the questions I asked the group of panelists was, where were you when you found out New Orleans was underwater? And it brought back the memory of where I was. And I was on this base in the middle of Nebraska. I was still active duty military. And we were war planning. Afghanistan and Iraq, those wars were well underway. And I just remember, as I sort of talk about in this piece, walking by a television and seeing how terrible it was and having no clue that this was happening because I was so laser focused on the war. No clue that the flooding was this bad. That moment sort of stayed with me. And here we are 2 decades later. And a lot of the lessons the military learned from Katrina and how to support civil authorities in a disaster seem to have been unlearned or forgotten or never learned perhaps by folks that have the keys to the National Guard today. So it felt like a right moment to sort of speak to the current moment, 20 years ago, and how sort of U.S. history sometimes converges.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, without further ado, do you want to go ahead and read it for us?
Absolutely. I'm Ted Johnson, and this is my piece about Trump's National Guard deployment and the way it's echoing mistakes made in Hurricane Katrina. 20 years ago this week, while I was serving as an aide to a general visiting a military installation in Nebraska, we learned that New Orleans was drowning. We were on base to coordinate electronic countermeasures against the rising number of insurgent attacks on service members in Iraq and Afghanistan. The nation knew a strong hurricane was barreling toward the Gulf Coast, but the nightly news was filled with reminders that Americans were dying every day in combat overseas. On our way into a secure facility, we slowed to watch cable news coverage of people wading through the streets with water up to their chests. It caught us off guard. We were aware of Katrina, but we were, like much of the country, thinking about the war. 2 days later, 80% of New Orleans was underwater. Across 4 states, nearly 1,400 people died, and damages from the hurricane and the levee breaches exceeded $125 billion. The federal government's bungled initial response to Katrina is remembered as much as the storm itself. But it's the structural failures that most affected the country and whose effects linger. Physical ones in the flood wall and levee breaches, social ones along lines of class and race, political ones that saw the city as a war zone rather than a natural disaster. More than 72,000 military members deployed to the Gulf Coast to join relief efforts, 2/3 of whom served in the National Guard. Their contributions to rescue and recovery are unparalleled, but some of the earliest images from the humanitarian crisis are of a combat-equipped Guard, sporting rifles and body armor and Kevlar helmets. One journalist noted that armored vehicles on the city's historic streets were like a scene from Iraq. They cruise around with soldiers' heads poking out of holes on top. Among the lessons from Katrina is the reminder that an armed National Guard on U.S. soil reveals the politics of elected officials, and it communicates to the public which people the government deems to be the problem. Through this lens, the White House decision to federalize, deploy, and arm Guard units in the nation's capital and in Los Angeles, with threats to do the same in Baltimore, Chicago, and New York, risks repeating mistakes made in Katrina. Politicians too often use the National Guard as an instrument of executive prerogative. It's long been this way, and the mission sometimes changes with the winds. In September 1957, Arkansas's governor directed the Guard, armed with bayoneted rifles, to defy the federal government and bar 9 students from integrating Little Rock Central High School. Weeks later, President Dwight D. Eisenhower federalized the same Guard contingent and ordered it to protect the students and prevent segregationists from obstructing federal law. While arming the Guard may be a political decision, telling troops whom to shoot, even if they don't, has ramifications far beyond politics. The first days after Katrina witnessed media outlets fueling the perception that the city was lawless and chaotic. False stories about roving bands of rapists, snipers and wanton murderers, and gunshots fired at helicopters were common and amplified nationally. Because of this inaccurate reporting and ideas about who the problem was, elements of the Guard were instructed to adopt a war footing. The governor of Louisiana warned residents and informed the country that these units have M16s and they're locked and loaded, saying these troops know how to shoot and kill, and they are more than willing to do so if necessary, and I expect they will. One teenager, after finally making it to the convention center with her family, noted the Guard's posture. She said, "They're just sitting up there like with rifles on them," she told The Atlantic, "like in a position ready to shoot. They really don't care. Who cares about a poor black 14-year-old girl?" Americans shouldn't be made to feel this way about their government, but especially not in the middle of a humanitarian crisis. There are, of course, events that require the restoration of order and the protection of lives and property. Outside of war, the largest deployment of the National Guard was in 2020, when more than 86,000 assisted in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic and in response to the civil unrest following the murder of George Floyd. For the protests and riots alone, 34 states and the District of Columbia mobilized more than 40,000 Guard members to support local authorities. Most armed activations are in this lane, but sometimes lives are not protected but lost, as at Kent State in 1970, when 4 students were killed and 9 wounded after an unnerved Guard unit opened fire. This was certainly on the mind of Louisiana native and no-nonsense Army General Russell Honore when he took charge of the military task force responding to Katrina. Not long after assuming command, there were clips of him barking orders at armed troops, reminding them why they were there and whom they were there to serve, saying, "Put those damn weapons down. This is a rescue mission, damn it." His leadership reframed the Katrina response for the country and reoriented the Guard, not its mission, but its posture and its priorities. Most importantly, for a nation thinking about war, the message was clear that there were no enemy combatants to fear in the waterlogged region, only hurting people in need of relief and aid. 2 years after the general's entourage learned about Katrina's flooding while war planning in Nebraska, a cyclone hit Bangladesh. I was stationed in Japan, and our task force deployed to a ship off the coast to deliver food, water, clothes, medicine, and other supplies, unarmed. Many of the folks on our staff spent time on war footing in Iraq, Afghanistan, or the Persian Gulf, and our leadership understood that Bangladeshis might be suspicious of the American military in its 6th year of combat, so the message to the crew was clear. We are not at war. We are here to help. Katrina taught that in a humanitarian crisis, especially in the United States with the National Guard on the scene, you shouldn't be armed if the mission is to lend a helping hand.
Thanks, Ted. That was great. I've got one more question for you. That's right after the break. Welcome back. So, Ted, I think you only just published this in the Washington Post, recently, but I'm wondering if you've gotten any reaction and how it's been received so far.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I do usually read through the comments on my pieces, and it seems the general thrust of the comments are one of 2 things. The first is, of course, Trump sees people as the enemy. That's why he's using the Guard this way. So it's like, yes, the lessons haven't been learned, and today is proof. The other sort of batch of comments are comparing New Orleans and Katrina's response to the president federalizing the Guard in D.C. to help stem crime, or whatever the latest explanation is different because the missions are different, which is, there's some truth to that, except for the fact that when an armed guard is on U.S. soil, the chances of a gun being fired increase exponentially. And even
Really?
though it's not a frequent occurrence, being armed, I can tell you as a military guy, means people are more likely to be shot. And when you're there to help, the last thing you need are guns. Again, with some exceptions.
Right, right. And, I think about Hurricane Katrina. It really was a true emergency, pretty difficult to dispute emergency.
Right.
And I think some of these National Guard situations are being determined as emergencies, but the rationales feel a bit squishy.
So you're absolutely right, and there's a lot of great work out there by folks who study the issue on presidential emergency powers, and so whereas Katrina was a natural disaster that became an emergency because of the breaches, what we are having or what we're seeing now is a president declaring an emergency unilaterally and then using the troops in the same way that he or she would if like an actual emergency were underway. And so because that emergency power is rarely contested by the Supreme Court or Congress, it kind of gives the president the license to sort of do whatever he wants to with the guard. So we are where we are because we have not learned all of the lessons from the past.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Ted Johnson. Always great to have you on.
It's good to be here.
And thanks for reading your story today.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening, and please stay tuned as we keep sharing some of our favorite stories from Washington Post Opinions. And we promise we are working on a regular podcast to come, more programming for you in the coming months. In the meantime, you can always send us your thoughts. Email impromptu@washpost.com. Until next time.